Tensions between Ukraine and Russia, two former Soviet states, escalated in late 2013 due to a landmark political and trade agreement with the European Union. After then Russian President Viktor Yanukovych suspended the talks, reportedly under pressure from Moscow, weeks-long protests in Kyiv turned violent. Then, in March 2014, Russia annexed Crimea, an autonomous peninsula in southern Ukraine with strong Russian allegiance, on the grounds that it was protecting its interests and that of its citizens. Speak Russian. First, thousands of Russian-speaking soldiers, nicknamed the Little Green Men and later recognized by Moscow as Russian soldiers, poured into the Crimean Peninsula. Within days, Russia completed its merger in a referendum that was called illegitimate by Ukraine and most of the world. Soon after, pro-Russian separatists in Ukraine's Donetsk and Luhansk regions declared independence from Kyiv, sparking months of fierce fighting. Although Kyiv and Moscow signed a peace accord in Minsk in 2015, brokered by France and Germany, there have been numerous ceasefire violations. According to United Nations figures, more than 3,000 civilians have been killed in conflict in eastern Ukraine since March 2014. The European Union and the United States have imposed a series of measures in response. Russia's actions in Crimea and eastern Ukraine, including economic ones. Sanctions target specific individuals, entities and sectors of the Russian economy. The Kremlin accuses Ukraine of causing tension in the east of the country and violating the Minsk ceasefire agreement. Kremlin has repeatedly denied that Russia is planning an invasion of Ukraine, insisting that Russia poses no threat to anyone and that any state moving troops across its territory should not set an alarm. Moscow considers increasing NATO support to Ukraine in the form of weapons, training and personnel, a threat to its own security. He also accused Ukraine of increasing its troops in preparation for an attempt to retake the Donbas, which Ukraine denied. Russian President Vladimir Putin has called for concrete legal agreements to rule out NATO's further eastward expansion into Russia's borders, saying the West has failed to live up to its previous verbal guarantees. Putin has also said that NATO deploying sophisticated weapons in Ukraine, such as missile systems, would be crossing a red line for Russia, amid concern in Moscow that Ukraine is being increasingly armed by NATO powers. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said in November that weapons and military advisors were already being supplied to Ukraine by the US and other NATO member states. And all this, of course, leads to a further aggravation of the situation on the borderline, he said. If the US and its NATO allies do not change course in Ukraine, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has warned that Moscow has the right to choose ways to ensure its legitimate security interests. The Ukrainian government argues that if Moscow so desires, it cannot prevent Kiev from establishing a closer relationship with NATO. Russia cannot prevent Ukraine from approaching NATO and has no say in relevant discussions, the State Department said in a statement to CNN in response to Russia's call to stop NATO's eastern expansion. Said in Russia's proposal to discuss so-called guarantees that the alliance will not extend eastward with NATO and the United States is illegal, he added. Ukraine claims that Russia is trying to destabilize the country, with the country's President Volodymyr Zelensky recently saying that a coup plan involving Ukrainians and Russians has been revealed. Ukraine's Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba warned that the planned coup could be part of Russia's pre-military invasion program. External military pressure is closely linked to the country's internal destabilization, he said. Tensions between the two countries have increased in Kiev, Ukraine's deepening energy crisis, which Moscow believes was deliberately caused. At the same time, the Zelensky administration faces many challenges. The popularity of the government has been stagnant in some of the domestic political issues, including the most recent of the third wave of the struggling economy and COVID-19 infection. Many people are also complaining that the government has not yet provided the promised benefits and has not ended the conflict in the eastern part of the country. Anti-government protests took place in Kiev. In a video speech on January 19, Zelensky urged Ukrainians to calm down amid growing anxiety about the possibility of a Russian invasion. We are clear about everything and are prepared for everything, he added. I truly believe that this year will end with no war with Russia. Kryvyi also sought to reassure Ukrainians who feared that the United States, its NATO allies and Russia could exclude Kiev from the debate. The decision about Ukraine without Ukraine is not a principle we follow, he said. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg has said that there will be a heavy price to pay if it invades NATO partner Ukraine again. We have many options. Economic sanctions, financial sanctions, political restraint, Stoltenberg said in a December 1 interview with CNN. After Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014, NATO strengthened its defenses with combat-ready combat groups in the eastern part of the alliance, in the Baltics, in Latvia, as well as in the Black Sea region, Stoltenberg said. Ukraine is not a member of NATO and therefore does not have the same security guarantees as members of NATO. But Stoltenberg rejected the possibility of Ukraine becoming a NATO member, saying that Russia had no right to tell Ukraine that it could not apply to join NATO. The highly profitable talks between Russia and NATO in Brussels in mid-January were not an easy discussion, according to Stoltenberg, who added that differences will not be easily surmounted. However, NATO allies and Russia expressed a need to resume dialogue, he said. President Joe Biden told Zelensky in a phone call that the United States and its allies would respond decisively if Russia continues to invade Ukraine. But Biden appeared to undermine that message when he later suggested at a White House press conference that a small incursion by Russia would provoke less of a response than a full-blown invasion of Russia. While Biden promised severe economic consequences for Russia if Putin sent troops across the border, including restricting financial conversions to US dollars, he argued that Western nations were out of sync on what to expect. Must do in the case of less violations. There are differences within NATO in terms of what countries are prepared to do, depending on what happens, he said. His remarks prompted the White House to quickly clarify. President Biden made it clear to the president of Russia. If Russian military forces cross the border with Ukraine, this is another invasion, and it will face a swift, stern, and united response. From the United States and our allies, Jen Psaki in a press release. The Ukrainian official told CNN he is shocked that US President Biden is distinguishing between aggression and thinks a small infiltration would not trigger sanctions. This gives Putin the green light to enter Ukraine at will, the official added. The diplomatic mess comes as Blinken prepares for further talks with European allies on the Russia-Ukraine crisis and meets with his Russian counterpart Sergei Lavrov. Blinken had previously warned Russia that further aggression could lead to dire consequences. Two defense officials told CNN on January 3 that the Department of Defense has developed military options for Biden should he decide to increase capabilities in Eastern Europe to further deter possible aggression out of Russia for Ukraine. The two officials stressed that this part of the conventional plan is carried out by the military and that the focus for now remains on diplomacy and potential economic sanctions. U.S. Secretary of State Wendy Sherman and Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov held meetings in Geneva on January 10 as the United States sought to defuse the threat of a Russian attack. The United States provided about $450 million in security assistance to Ukraine in 2021, the Pentagon said, including a small arms and ammunition package in December. The Biden administration is currently considering new options, including providing more weapons to Ukraine to fight the Russian occupation, a senior U.S. official told CNN. The Obama administration was taken by surprise when Russia invaded Crimea in 2014 and supported an uprising in the Donbas region of eastern Ukraine. U.S. officials say they are determined not to get caught up in another Russian military operation. Our concern is that Russia could make the grave mistake of trying to reverse what began in 2014 when it concentrated its forces along the border into sovereign Ukrainian territory and claimed they were provoked, Blinken later said. Last year. The unrest in former Soviet Kazakhstan was bad news for Putin in early 2022. Unrest. But experts warn that Russian intervention is unlikely to be the end of the story. Blinken says that once the Russians are in your house, it's sometimes difficult to get them to leave. Another problem revolves around the power supply. Ukraine considers the controversial Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline, which connects Russia's gas supplies directly to Germany, a threat to its security. Nord Stream 2 is one of two pipelines that Russia has placed underwater in the Baltic Sea, in addition to the traditional network of onshore pipelines passing through Eastern Europe, including Ukraine. Kiev views pipelines through Ukraine as a defensive measure against Russian aggression, as any military action could disrupt the vital flow of gas to Europe. US analysts and lawmakers have raised concerns that Nord Stream 2 will increase Europe's dependence on Russian gas and could allow Moscow to selectively target countries like Ukraine by cutting energy without further disrupting European supplies. Ignoring Eastern European countries would also mean that those countries would be stripped of the lucrative shipping fees Russia would have to pay. In May 2021, the Biden administration lifted sanctions on the company behind Nord Stream 2, effectively giving the company the green light. U.S. officials said the move was in the interest of U.S. national security as it sought to rebuild its fractured relationship with Germany. In November, the United States imposed new sanctions on an entity with links to Russia and a vessel linked to Nord Stream 2. Several U.S. senators have called for the imposition of measures. New sanctions to prevent Russia from using the pipeline as a weapon. Ukraine also called for tougher measures.